this video, we're going to cover the structure of water and its emergent properties. Everything depends on water. It's the most abundant molecule in cells. Water is the medium in which the molecules of life interact. So before we start this lecture, make sure you've taken a shot of water and you have a drink bottle next to you. Stay hydrated and let's get started. In the molecules and chemical bonds lecture, we looked at how a water molecule consists of two hydrogen atoms joined to one oxygen atom by covalent bonds. We touched on electronegativity, which is the unequal sharing of electrons, and oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen, so the electrons are more drawn to oxygen than it is to hydrogen. This is known as a polar covalent bond, and water is a polar molecule because it has regions of positive and negative charges, and there is an unequal sharing of electrons. Polar molecules tend to interact with other polar molecules, whereas non-polar molecules tend to not interact with polar molecules. And we can even organize molecules or different regions of the same molecules into two types, depending on how they interact with water. There's hydrophilic, or water-loving, and hydrophobic, water-fearing. They're scared of water. Hydrophilic compounds are polar, which is why they dissolve readily in water, whereas hydrophobic compounds are non-polar, which means they don't have areas of positive or negative charges. So they orient themselves to minimize their contact with water. They're scared of water and they just want to be left alone. Okay? Example of this is oil and water. Oil molecules are hydrophobic, so when they're mixed with water, the oil molecules will arrange themselves into droplets to avoid contact with water, minimize the oil-water interface. Okay, so going back to the structure of water, the oxygen molecule has a slight negative charge, delta minus, and the hydrogens have slight positive charges, delta plus, and this is due to its polar covalent bonds. The electrons are not shared equally. Because the oxygen and hydrogen atoms have partial charges, water molecules tend to orient themselves to minimize the repulsion of like charges, so that positive charges are near negative charges. Okay? Now, the slightly positive hydrogen of one molecule is attracted to the partially negative oxygen of a nearby molecule, and it's going to form a hydrogen bond. The partial positive charge of a hydrogen atom is attracted to the partial negative charge of an oxygen atom. And right here, oxygen can form two hydrogen bonds. Now, hydrogen bonds are much weaker than covalent bonds, but hydrogen bonds are what influences the structure of both liquid water and ice. When water is in its liquid form, these hydrogen bonds are quite fragile. So the bonds form, they break, and then they reform again. Hydrogen bonds create a dense structure in water. And in ice, it's less dense, and it's going to form this beautiful crystalline structure that's highly ordered. So when water freezes, a lot of these water molecules become hydrogen bonded to four other water molecules, which forms an open crystalline structure, or ice. And then when we increase the temperature, the ice melts and the hydrogen bonds that were formed breaks. And water molecules can be packed closely together and become dense again. Okay? So it's these hydrogen bonds that give water incredible properties. So let's now subtract complexity and go through the four emergent properties of water that impact life. This includes cohesive behavior, ability to moderate temperature, expansion upon freezing, and versatility as a solvent. So take a shot of water and let's go through cohesion. Okay. So we covered how water molecules stick to one another because of hydrogen bonding, which is why water is more structured in comparison to other liquids. Cohesion is the linking or attraction of like molecules. Molecules of the same kind being attracted to each other, usually held by hydrogen bonds, which is why water molecules have strong cohesive forces because they have the ability to form hydrogen bonds with one another. And it's cohesion that results in high surface tension, which is a measure of how hard it is to break or stretch the surface of a liquid. It's the tendency of a liquid surface to break or resist breakage when placed under tension. So let's take water molecules at the surface. The water molecules will be arranged in a way where they form hydrogen bonds with other water molecules. Now, the water molecules on one side are exposed to air, so they won't have any other water molecules to bond with. And so what's going to happen is they're going to form even stronger bonds with the molecules they can bond with. Because of this phenomenon, it gives water high surface tension, which is why some plants can float on water and you can slightly overfill a glass and it's going to form a dome shaped just above the rim of the glass. Okay, so cohesion is also responsible and helps with the transport of water and dissolved nutrients in plants. As water evaporates from a leaf, hydrogen bonds between water molecules help hold together the column of water within cells. Okay, so that's cohesion. There's also another force called adhesion. Cohesion is the attraction between like molecules. Adhesion, on the other hand, is the attraction or linking of one kind of molecule to another type. Alright? For example, in plants, adhesion of water by hydrogen bonds to cell walls. The molecules of cell walls help resist the downward pull of gravity. So water molecules are able to link to another type of substance. Both cohesive and adhesive forces are important in life. So here, let's show these different forces. These pink lines are water molecules linking to other water molecules. This is cohesion, hydrogen bonding between water molecules. And the yellow lines here are the work of adhesion, adhesive forces, water molecules attracted to another kind of polar molecules. That's one property of water. Let's now move on to the next property, and that is moderation of temperature. Now, I mentioned before that hydrogen bonds are what gives water incredible properties. Hydrogen bonds of water also influence how water responds to heating. It can absorb or release large amount of heat with only a slight change in its own temperature. Let's break down temperature and heat to understand how this property works. Okay? Molecules are always in constant motion, and a type of energy is called kinetic energy, energy that is associated with movement. Energy is the capacity to cause change, the ability to rearrange matter. So kinetic energy is, for example, when you're running, when your muscles are contracting, when you're taking a shot of water, stay hydrated, okay? And when molecules move faster, kinetic energy increases. And kinetic energy that is associated with the random movement of molecules or atoms is called thermal energy. Thermal energy and temperature are not the same thing, but they are closely related. I view them as cousins or something. And thermal energy of a body of matter reflects the total kinetic energy, and this depends on the matter's volume. Whereas temperature represents the average kinetic energy of the molecules in a body of water, regardless of volume. So thermal energy is a total kinetic energy, and this depends on the matter's volume. Whereas temperature is the average kinetic energy of molecules in a body of matter, regardless of volume. When water is heated, let's say you're about to make yourself a cup of tea or coffee after you watch this lecture, the motion of molecules increases, their average speed increases, and so the total amount of energy also increases. And comparing thermal energy and temperature, I mentioned thermal energy depends on the matter's volume. So let's take a swimming pool. A swimming pool contains more thermal energy because of its greater volume, even though your cup of hot water has a much higher temperature than that of a swimming pool, okay? Now, when we bring in two objects together of different temperature, thermal energy passes from the warmer object to the cooler object until they're about the same temperature. And thermal energy in transfer from one object to another is called heat. So let's say you decide to make yourself an iced latte, or you go down to a cafe and get yourself a cold drink after you watch this lecture. Now, that ice that's been added, that ice doesn't add to that sweet coldness of the liquid. Instead, it absorbs thermal energy from the liquid as the ice melts. And honestly, for an iced latte, it's worth melting for, alright? So, this ability of water to stabilize and moderate temperature comes from its relatively high specific heat. Specific heat is the amount of heat. So recall heat is thermal energy in transfer from one object to another. It's the amount of heat that must be absorbed or lost for 1 gram of a substance to change its temperature by 1 degrees. And water has an unusually high specific heat, and so it's going to change its temperature less than other liquids when it absorbs or loses a given amount of heat. So specific heat it's sort of a measure of how well a substance resists changing its temperature when it absorbs or releases heat. When water is heated, some of the energy added from the heat, that's used to break hydrogen bonds instead of causing more movement or motion among water molecules. And so temperature increases less compared if there were no hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonds break when heat is absorbed, and they are formed when heat is released. Because hydrogen bonds are abundant, it allows water to be more resistant to temperature changes and other substances. So you may be thinking, okay, that's pretty cool, it's pretty awesome, but how is this relevant to life? Why is this important? Large volume of water can absorb and store a huge amount of heat from the sun in the daytime, while only increasing temperature by a few degrees. And at night, as water begins to cool, it can warm the air, and so it has the ability to moderate air temperature. The ocean, for instance, minimizes temperature changes and stabilizes the temperature on Earth, creating a more favorable environment for life. Let's now transition to how terrestrial organisms avoid overheating, as well as how water stabilizes temperature through evaporative cooling. Molecules can go from a liquid state and enter the air as gas or vapor. This process, or transformation from one state to another, is called vaporization or evaporation. Some evaporation can occur at any temperature. And let's break down what happens to the average kinetic energy of these molecules when they evaporate. We mentioned before that temperature is the average kinetic energy of molecules, regardless of volume. And when molecules move fast enough, their speed increases and they can transform into gas. So if we were to heat a liquid, the average kinetic energy of molecules increases and the liquid evaporates more rapidly. We measure this through heat of evaporation, which is the quantity of heat a liquid must absorb for 1 gram of it to be converted from the liquid to gas. And water has a high heat of evaporation, high heat of vaporization. This is caused from its hydrogen bonds, which must be broken before the molecules can go from a liquid state to a gaseous state, a water vapor. Now you may be thinking, why is this emergent property important and relevant in life? Because it helps moderate Earth's climate. When a liquid evaporates, the surface of the liquid, where it came from, cools down. The temperature decreases. This is known as evaporative cooling. The molecule with the highest kinetic energy transforms into vapor, and so the surface cools down. This is important in nature because it prevents terrestrial organisms from overheating and also stabilizes temperatures in lakes. And when you sweat, evaporation of sweat from our skin helps prevent overheating as body heat evaporates, okay? So make sure you've taken a shot of water and cool yourself down, stay hydrated. And now let's discuss how ice floats on water and how water expands. Let's talk about the third emergent property, and that is expansion upon freezing. Earlier in this lecture, we talked about how water is less dense as a solid than as a liquid, which is why ice floats on liquid water. Other substances become more dense when they solidify, whereas water expands. Again, this is due to hydrogen bonds. At temperature above 4 degrees Celsius, water expands as it warms and it contracts as it cools. Now, when water temperature drops to 0 degrees Celsius, water begins to freeze as water molecules move really slowly and hydrogen bonds cannot be broken. Each water molecule is then hydrogen bonded to 4 other water molecules, and they form a crystalline lattice, just like this here. And then when temperature rises above 0 degrees, or the ice absorbs enough energy, enough heat for its temperature to rise above 0 degrees, hydrogen bonds break and the ice will start to melt. How is this relevant to life? The ability of ice to float on water is really important. It floats because it's less dense. If ice sank, then oceans would freeze, making life here on Earth impossible. Okay, so that's the third emergent property. Let's now discuss the fourth emergent property, and that is versatility as a solvent. Now, before we talk about what makes water a very versatile solvent, let's first define what a solution, a solute, and a solvent is before we move forward. A solution is a liquid that is a homogeneous mixture of two or more substances. It's composed of matter that all exist in the same state, liquid. A solute is a substance that is dissolved in a solution, and a solvent is the dissolving agent of a solution, and water is the most versatile solvent. So let's go through an example here using table salt or sodium chloride that is placed in water. If you recall, sodium ions are positively charged and chloride ions are negatively charged. So water, being our solvent here, the sodium and chloride ions are attracted to water molecules. Early in the lecture, we broke down the structure of water. Oxygen molecules have a partial negative charge and hydrogen molecules have a partial positive charge, which makes other polar molecules and ions bind with them. So oxygen is attracted to sodium ions or cations because it's positively charged. The way to remember cations and anions, cats have paws, which makes it positive. All right, and the hydrogen atoms are attracted to chloride anions. What happens then, the water molecule surrounds the individual sodium and chloride ions and it separates the two, and hydration shells are formed. A hydration shell is a sphere of water molecules around each dissolved ions. So now we have a solution of two solutes, sodium and chloride ions mixed homogeneously with water, which is our solvent. When water is a solvent, this is known as an aqueous solution. And the reason why water is a versatile solvent is because it dissolves more substances than any other liquid. Alright, so that is the emergent properties of water. Let's now briefly discuss acids and bases, and let's bring on the pH scale. In any solution of water, a small quantity of the water molecules exist as protons and hydroxide ions. That's because a hydrogen atom involved in a hydrogen bond between two water molecules moves from one molecule to the other. And so when this happens, the hydrogen atom leaves its electron behind, and what is transferred is a proton, a hydrogen ion with a charge of +1. And the water molecule, the lost of proton, is now a hydroxide ion, which has a charge of -1. So the proton binds to the other water molecule, making that molecule a hydronium ion. So we have two water molecules. The proton or hydrogen ion is transferred to the other molecule, making it a hydronium ion. And the other water molecule, the lost of proton, is now a hydroxide ion. So why would there be an imbalance of protons and hydroxide ion concentrations in an aqueous solution? And this is where acids and bases come in. When an acid is dissolved in water, they donate protons or hydrogen ions to the solution. So what is an acid? An acid is a substance that increases the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution. So there's more hydrogen ions than hydroxide ions. For example, let's take hydrochloric acid. When hydrochloric acid is added to water, hydrogen ions dissociate from chloride ions. On the other hand, a base is a substance that decreases hydrogen ion concentration of a solution. How? Some bases can directly accept hydrogen ions, and there are other bases that dissociates to form hydroxide ions. So one example being sodium hydroxide. In water, sodium hydroxide dissociates into its ions. Solutions with a higher concentration of hydroxide ions than hydrogen ions are known as basic solutions. The pH scale then is just a simple method, numerical method for expressing the range of hydrogen ion concentration. pH, the power of hydrogen. It measures the proton concentration. And this is important because the pH influences several chemical reactions as well as biological processes. We can calculate it by following this formula here, the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. The pH of a solution can range from 0 to 14. A solution is neutral, pH of 7, when the concentrations of protons and hydroxide ions are equal. Pure water has a pH of 7, and the pH of most cells is approximately 7 as well. When the concentration of protons is higher than that of hydroxide ions, the pH is lower than 7, and the solution is acidic. And when the concentration of protons is lower than that of hydroxide ions, the pH is higher than 7, and the solution is basic. The pH of blood is slightly basic, approximately 7.4. Recalling back to acids and bases, an acid is a molecule that releases protons. It increases the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution. And a base is a molecule that decreases the hydrogen ion concentration by accepting protons in aqueous solutions. Okay? And before I forget, each pH unit represents a tenfold difference in hydrogen and hydroxide ion concentration because the pH scale is logarithmic. In this lecture, we learned that water is a polar molecule with hydrogen and oxygen joined by covalent bonds and how there is an unequal sharing of electrons. We broke down the 4 emergent properties of water: cohesive behavior, ability to moderate temperature, expansion upon freezing, and versatility as a solvent. And lastly, we covered what an acid and base is and how the pH scale is a measure of the concentration of protons in a solution. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe to EKG Science so you don't miss a single lecture. And remember, subtract complexity and slow down. To study the next lecture, simply click the next video or you can view the entire playlist. Hey! Stop procrastinating.